smartphone is the key, both in the sense of reading, in the sense of unlocking to the metropolitan territory, to the present forms of the social factory. While maybe not in itself productive, it is increasingly a precondition of productivity. The social relations it allows are a condition of possibility of metropolitan existence. And this connects to a question that follows from a previous presentation of your book, in which in which Jason and Paul Matic discussed the relation between contemporary urban settings and revolts, taking up after Gerardo, I think it was Gerardo who made this question, of the claim that the Gilets jaunes were one of the first anti-metropolitan movements. So maybe it isn't the iPhone or the smartphone, the really technical innovation of our era, but the metropolis, to which the iPhone is merely an appendix. So I guess this isn't really a question, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on all of this. And so, yeah, I pass my word to Mårten. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Luhuna. And thanks, Gerardo, Stephen, Jason, I'm sorry, Benjamin, and everyone for letting me be here. So the geniality of Jason's book is the simple but radical insistence that capitalism is a mode of production based on industrial labor, and that when this industrial system begins to stagnate, capitalism stagnates. This might seem simple, but we often forget what it means that capitalism is a mode of production, namely a specific form of production, and we are seldom thinking of what it means that capitalism can begin to stagnate. Let us begin with what it means that capitalism is a specific form of production, and see what Jason is helping us to pinpoint or see. First of all, it entails nothing but the simple fact that capitalism equals industrialization. And by pointing to how the world of services point to an end, or at least a problem to the process of industrialization, Jason raises the question of a possible end and even possible exteriority to capital. Capital, we often hear, is a world, a totality, a total form of subsumption. There is, many argue, nothing beyond capitalism, nothing outside capitalism. Capital rules everything and can form anything to its image. But Jason shows that this is not the whole story. It's not false, but it's not the whole story. It's not the whole truth. For capitalism is a mode of production we can equate with the rise of the entity we call factory. So capitalism, Jason shows, is related, or in a sense identical, with industrialism. And capitalism, as Marx understands it, begins with the factory system, or at least with the emergence of a market that increasingly makes it possible for the factory to emerge. In Das Kapital, Marx shows how the history of modern industry begins with capitalists taking over pre-capitalist production and contracting workers to sit together, and I quote, for the same time and in the same room, and to collaboratively produce different types of commodity for the markets that will be sold, in the world market. This collaboration breeds the idea of, it creates the idea of industry, which Marx writes, and now I quote, both historically and conceptually is the starting point of the capitalist mode of production. Let me repeat this. Industry is both historically and conceptually the starting point of the capitalist mode of production. I would say that the importance of Jason's book is to remind us that the real meaning of this essential fact, capitalism as a mode of production begins with industry, is that the end of capitalism is the end of industry as we know it. And what Jason chronicles in his excellent book is the stagnation of the industrial world that has become the habitat of our species to the point that we cannot imagine anything beyond the factory or anything beyond the industrial system. What would a world beyond the factory and industry look like? No one really knows. The most radical anarchists, primitists, or critics of civilization, like John Sersan, or the more intelligent and speculative Jacques Camat, can only develop a sort of negative theology here. They can plead, as Camat does, to an inversion of the process that led us to the point where we are. Sometimes they can do this in a manner that can give us real insights, but often the critique becomes so abstract that it tells us nothing. But what is interesting with Jason's book is that he points to the fact that the industrial system is in a deep stagnation, and that capitalism therefore produces a form of outside in services, at least in the sense that services is a real sign of the fact that industry is broken. I would like to hear Jason define the concept of stagnation and discuss it, and perhaps especially related to the movements that we see all over the world at the moment. And yeah, I would like him to help us to understand what stagnation is. But now I can say that one sign of the stagnation of capitalism is that less and less workers are employed in the world of factories. Less and less capital are invested in developing manufacturing. And the pace of productivity is falling all over the world. Smith or Jason examines this process of deindustrialization and points to how this becomes not only a structural problem for capitalism, but a civilizational problem, in the sense that the mode of life that at least characterized the United States and Western Europe after the Second World War is now forever gone. We see rust belts all over the world, and Gilets jaunes in France and now the siege of Capitol in Washington are good signs of what this means politically. And with the stagnation of industry, we also see, I would say, the end of history. When Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History and The Last Man, in order to celebrate the victory of liberal democracy, he failed to see that the reason why the Soviet Union collapsed was that it stagnated due to its inability to adjust itself to an increasingly post-industrial world. The period after the Second World War led to the real globalization of industry, and what has been called industrial overcapacity, in the sense that more factories and more industrialized nations fought for hegemony on the same world market. This led, as Jason argues, and can explain much better than me, to the stagnation of industry. And it is this stagnation that Fukuyama, if he was clear-sighted, should have identified with the end of history. For what is history? History, as we know it, is the production of the world of capitalism that is moving towards its eclipse, not in the sense of a literal end, but in the sense of becoming, I would say, ungovernable, or as Gerardo perhaps would say, post-hegemonic. History is nothing but the history of the contradiction that has its center in that form we call industry. Capitalism is therefore consolidated in part through the so-called agrarian revolution, the rationalization and industrialization of agriculture that liberates people from farming through an original accumulation and forces them to look for work in the industries that are increasingly beyond the factory gate. What Jason shows is that capitalism develops in step with its industrialization of production, which I can describe as the basis of the first, second, and third industrial revolutions in the classical economic sense, and which in many ways should be seen as an uneven and parallel process, of course. So, according to Marx, the first industrial revolution is a result of the expropriation of peasants, nobles, and the church, and so on, of land, the so-called original accumulation, which becomes significant in England. And this accumulation lays the foundation for the economic and technological changes that, through the development of manufacture, make large-scale industry the most important player in the world economy. So we have the rise of industry. The second industrial revolution drives this violent deproletarization of the world population. And it drives it further, and it's usually dated between 1874 and 1970. And this means the spread of the electrical engineering and the increasing use of electricity, internal combustion engines, and steel, and so on. And this second industrial revolution should be seen as a broader process that continues, according to some at least, until the 1970s, if you believe that some kind of third industrial revolution happened there. It depends on how you view this process, of course. But this third industrial revolution, described by Roman Alcoati, who Luhuna is an expert on, as a hyperindustrialization, implies an attempt to industrialize also services, or the life beyond the factory, in a sense. And the geniality, of course, with Jason's book is that he shows that services implies a limit to this process. So the third industrial revolution is leading to a greater increase in workers in the service sector than in the manufacturing industry. And Jason's books shows the crisis that this entails for industrialization as such. So what Jason shows is that the real industry, in other words, the real industry, I mean factories and so forth, lays the foundation for its own downfall and collapse, in the sense that capital's attempts to reduce working hours and to push more and more productivity out of less workers or so on, lead to a form of stagnation or even crisis. Capitalism is therefore starting to reveal that its center, the factory or industry, is perhaps not collapsing, but at least moving towards a sort of standstill or sort of fragmentization. Since the factory is, in a sense, moving towards its end as a historical form of production. For industry is, and I quote Marx again, both historically and conceptually, the starting point of the capitalist mode of production. So when industry comes into a crisis, we see historically and conceptually the end point of the capitalist mode of production. And end, I think here in as something that Fukuyama tried to understand as the end of history, not as a literal end that everything just disappears, but as a form of exhaustion of a potential, a form of end, a form of senescence, a form of getting old. And every attempt in this world to conserve the factory and to conserve industry, which is something that increasingly the political right wing is talking about, especially in the United States, it's interesting to see that more and more Republicans are talking about the need to construct the Republic Party as a form of what they call the multiracial working class party based on industry. And the geniality of Jason's book is that he shows that this attempt to conserve something is simply a conservation of a social form that in the end just has no future. So the question for everyone who wants to move beyond capitalism is, what would a world beyond the factory look like? What would a world beyond the industry look like? Is that even possible? And what is stagnation? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Luhuna and Mårten, for really two brilliant comments on the book. And now we'll pass the mic to Jason for a response. And then if you guys want to pick up on something that Jason says, feel free. And then we can open it up for more general questions from the audience, ¿no? Después que terminen esta intervención de Jason y de Mårten y Luhuna, podemos tomar preguntas de ustedes. Solamente pueden decir yo en la sección de comentarios, ¿sí?
Okay, thank you very much. I really have to say I'm really honored to have had such thoughtful and in some sense kind of not only thoughtful but kind of interventions which expand the scope of what my book I think is fundamentally about. And I think that this is really important for me because in some sense they're moments where I hint at some of these questions, but I don't develop them at great length, in part because of my own limitations and in part because of the limitations of the format, kind of a short book. But I should also say that I wanted, in some sense, there to be opportunity for intelligent engagement with the book, which would allow people to sort of draw out some of the implications that I don't spell out. So I think that's really, and this is kind of an ideal context for that to happen. So I just want to thank both Luhuna and Mårten for their interventions, and I should say more generally, thanks for hosting this conversation in general to Gerardo and everyone else. I'm going to try to make I'm going to try to zigzag my way through these responses. They're very, very complicated, and there's no way I can address them in any kind of satisfactory way. But let me make a few points. One of them is the quotation that Mårten offered us from Marx, the idea that the factory as a mode of producing or a mode of production, as a form of production, is both historically and conceptually, I think he says, the origin of the capitalist mode of production. I'm not sure if that's exactly what the quote was, but it was something like that. And I thought this is a really, really interesting passage. I think I know the passage. It happens a few places in Marx, I think, both the first volume, chapter 15, but also in the Grundrisse. And this idea that the factory is conceptually the origin of the capitalist mode of production is really, really fascinating to me. And it's something that I sort of hint at certain points, I think in the beginning of the book, as a kind of very important way to think about the question of automation, because there are two kind of places to think about this. Number one is, you'll remember that in chapter 15 in particular of the first volume of Capital, Marx refers to Andrew Uhr's book on the automatic factory. And it's a very, very important book for him in trying to articulate what he understands by the factory or the form of the factory. But so it's essential for, at least for my argument, that the notion of the factory is correlated with or connected to the notion of the automatic very, very early on in the history of the industrialization of England and more generally in the history of the capitalist mode of production. So that's 1835, Andrew Uhr's book is. Now the question is, why is it conceptually the origin? So I want to just sort of underline that as a kind of question that I'd like to return to. I would make this point though, that you'll remember there's another famous kind of passage in the first volume of Capital where Marx refers to capital as an automatic subject, right? An automatic subject. And much has been said about this. I don't think it's necessarily a very important passage, in fact. But nevertheless, the term automatic appears only once, maybe 2-3 times in the entire book of Capital. And it's the first time it's in the context of the general concept of capital, which is first developed in a kind of preliminary form in chapter 4, and then later in the discussion of the automatic factory. So there's this relationship that's kind of established in a kind of a tenuous way, maybe, between the concept of capital and the form of production that we call the factory. The automatic factory, in fact. So that's the first thing I wanted to point out, just as a kind of footnote to Mårten's intervention. Now, I should say a little bit more about just the basic idea behind the book, because these are very, very developed and complex responses to a book that not everyone has read. And what I would say is that the book is really a critique or a critical engagement with discourses around automation since around 2008. And most of these discourses on automation tend to suggest that we, that is to say, the kind of advanced economies of Europe and Western Europe and North America are in the midst of a kind of radical technological revolution, which in some sense might be the third industrial revolution that Mårten points out. It might be the fourth one. Sometimes they say it's the second machine age. Sometimes it's industry 4.0. There's a lot of kind of branding that goes on around these books, which are oftentimes written by business school professors, not by economists, and they have a lot of traction in the popular press. And so my question was simply this: why is it that these books? There's a couple very famous ones. One's called Rise of the Robots. Why are these books, and why is the discourse around automation so prevalent in a context which is otherwise marked by by stagnation, to use a term that is in the subtitle of the book, but also that Mårten underlines, or by relentless, really relentless crisis. Certainly since 2008, but really crisis since 2000 or since the 1970s, let's say. And I think that's a really important, just try to think through why is it that these things can coexist, right? A kind of prevailing sense of not only economic, but really social crisis for at least a decade and maybe for half a century. And at the same time, these claims being made about a technological revolution which will totally transform labor processes, in particular the service sector, and which will result in a kind of explosion of labor productivity. So that's the kind of basic sort of contradiction or tension that the book starts out from. And I guess I would say that the way the book is sort of moves in kind of, the kind of basic steps of the book is I start out from what I consider to be the kind of mainstream economic discourse and the kind of contradictions of that discourse. And one of the things that I really sort of settle on is the idea that's formulated as early as the late 80s by Robert Solow, famous economist, who formulates this idea of a productivity paradox. And the paradox is this. He says something like, why is it that I see computers everywhere except in productivity statistics? That is to say, the statistics of labor productivity, in particular, the declining labor productivity gains in these so-called industrialized or advanced economies. So that's the paradox. Computers everywhere, but in productivity statistics. Or we see the proliferation of computers in both as objects in the world, as processes that affect our everyday life, and also in discourse. But nevertheless, we also acknowledge or recognize that there's been this kind of radical drop-off in labor productivity. So that's the kind of tension, right? And that's the mainstream economic discourse. So that's where I start from, and I try to consolidate and synthesize and criticize that discourse. And that's kind of the first third of the book. Then I try to develop a little bit more critical approach to the question. And I tend to use a kind of Marxist and maybe even a kind of value theoretical language to do this in the middle of the book. And the two kind of central categories or concepts that I sort of interrogate are, on the one hand, productivity. Like, what do we mean when we say production or productivity? On the other hand, the category of services, right? Because this is a term that we all recognize that there's been this massive explosion, at least relative to manufacturing employment, of services. But the term is, and it's something like over 80% in the US and probably in England, it might be a little bit more. But generally, we're talking 75, 80% in Western Europe and the US. Now, it might be actually much higher in other countries, like India, for example. But nevertheless, the moment you actually try to sort of understand what the service sector is or what a service is, or you start to compare different types of labor processes or different kind of the ways in which different types of service activities relate to the total valorization process, everything becomes incredibly incoherent. So that's the kind of middle part of the book where I try to understand services in a slightly different set of terms. And then finally, I talk about, as Luhuna in particular emphasized, the way in which the kind of shifts that I'm going to be pointing to in this kind of relentlessly crisis, this kind of decades of economic crisis, economic and social crisis, the way in which struggle, the forms of struggle, are transformed in that process. And so it's a kind of, so that's the basic trajectory of the book, a kind of mainstream economic discourse, a kind of critique of that, a kind of shift into a more conceptual and theoretical framework where I talk about what is productivity? What do we mean by services? Why are these concepts not particularly helpful in some cases in understanding what we see around us? And then finally, I sort of point to some of the prospects for struggle, but also looking around and just seeing what sort of struggles are we seeing. So that's the basic starting point. Let me be trying to think of the best way to approach this. I think that I should start with the notion of industrialization, maybe, since it seems like a kind of starting point to think about some of the other questions. The first thing I would say is that, if you wanted to define this in relatively orthodox Marxist terms, you would say that it simply implies a kind of rising technical and in most cases, rising organic composition of capital, meaning simply that the ratio of capital to labor is rising, right? And in technical terms, that means in use value terms, in almost physical units, like a single laborer or a single group of laborers is going to command and in some sense be subordinated to a larger and larger number of machines. It's a technical composition of capital is a very obscure idea, actually, I think, in Marx, but I just want to say that's the basic notion, right? And then, of course, value composition is a slightly different notion, but the notion is that, or the idea is that the rising technical composition usually implies a rising value composition as well. There are lots of exceptions. So that's one, right? Is this kind of increasing capital intensity of the labor process. More and more machines are relative to the massive labor that's mobilized in the labor process. The second is centralization and concentration of capital. That's also a key function of the industrialization process. And then I think importantly for me, at least in the book, is this idea that industrialization implies the implementation of a kind of general purpose technology. So you have these kind of revolutionary moments, if you like, or moments of kind of broad innovation within production, in which some technology, and Mårten cited a few of them, like steam engines, or the use of electrical turbines, a kind of electrical dynamos. That is to say, so that factories in the late 19th century and early 20th century no longer had to produce their own energy, right? They were able to draw energy from a kind of centralized electrical network and that sort of thing. So there's this idea that there's a kind of implementation of a technology which is not restricted to a specific line of production or even a specific sector, but kind of it's disseminated across the economy. And what does that mean? That means that the same kind of technology is used in a steel factory as is used in an automobile factory, or in a same kind of technology will be used in a shoe manufacturing factory and a light bulb manufacturing factory. And so what that does is it means that the labor processes in each of those industries, which were formerly highly specific and very craft-based, suddenly become increasingly similar to one another. And there's a kind of tendency for those labor processes to sort of like equalize at a kind of semi-skilled level, if you like. In other words, the highly technical and oftentimes very difficult to learn craft processes are eliminated or transformed by this kind of general technology. And people in different industries, workers in different industries, suddenly find themselves doing very, very similar tasks in a way that they would be, would not be the case in a kind of craft or manufacturing in the Marxist sense of manufacture epoch. So the final point to make about that is that this notion of industrialization usually implies some sort of not only equalization of labor processes and skills, but also wages, at least within the national context. And this is very, very important for thinking about class composition and, in some sense, the kind of unity, the kind of material unity of the class. If all workers in different industries find themselves performing tasks which are relatively similar, and they find themselves working in factories which are maybe the same size, roughly, large, these industries oftentimes will be increasingly centralized in a few industrial clusters and so on and so forth, then you find that the class is able to see itself not simply as subordinated in a kind of fragmented way to this or that boss or this or that company, but they find themselves in some sense capable of a kind of solidarity of identity, but also of action across what were formerly separate lines of production. So those are all important features, I think, of the factory system, I guess I want to say. And I think that those are the things that tendency of, in an increasing, what's the word, kind of homogenization of lines of production across the economy, is that process is one that's come to a kind of halt in some sense. And I think that what we're seeing instead is a kind of devolution, or a kind of refragmentation of labor processes across the economy in a way that has as its kind of effect an increasing fragmentation of the class itself, the working class itself. So let me try to say a little bit more about that. And this is sort of addressing, in some sense, both Mårten and Luhuna in ways that I hope are relevant. Maybe as an aside, let me just say one thing about stagnation, since Mårten brought it up. You know, there are lots of discourses on stagnation, and some of them are quite interesting, and they're quite old, in fact. If you look at the Monthly Review school, people like Paul Sweezy, they're talking about stagnation since the 30s, right, as a kind of long-term tendency of late capitalism. And, you know, the recent discourse on secular stagnation has its roots in the 30s as well. And so there's some really, really interesting, you know, sort of, there's an interesting world, an entire world, and a real, almost a century of discourse around this tendency towards stagnation. But nevertheless, in a kind of very, very simple thumbnail way, it simply means a kind of growthlessness, both at the level of you know, something like GDP, something that everyone can acknowledge, that there's been a kind of slowdown in GDP growth. Of course, there's been, as I talk about at great length in my book, a kind of slowdown in labor productivity gains. So it's a kind of stagnation in which, where in the 19th century, at least in terms of the ideology of capitalism, we understand capitalism to be this this form of production, or this mode of production, in which labor processes are constantly being revolutionized. I mean, Marx himself talks like that. In fact, you can see that in many industries, there's been very, very little change in labor process for decades. And then finally, there's the question of a kind of, which again, all the mainstream economists and commentators agree on, there's been this incredible collapse in capital investment, or investment in fixed capital, since really 2000, but you can trace it back farther if you want, but especially since 2000. And this is a really key category for reasons that I talk about in the book. So I don't want to, I'm gonna try to summarize really quickly here in terms of class composition. The question of deindustrialization, to use a term which might be relevant in this context, implies, as I suggested earlier, a kind of counter tendency to the one that I described earlier. Industrialization implies a kind of convergence of wages, skills, labor processes through the implementation on a broad scale of a particular technology. Deindustrialization implies a kind of increasing fragmentation of the class. So what that means is that as the labor processes become more specific, so if I'm take care of a child, it's not the same thing, obviously, as if I'm working in retail or in a warehouse somewhere, or if I work as a security guard, or if I work as a teacher, and so on and so forth. These are all labor processes which are quite distinct. Sometimes they're grouped together, and certain of them are grouped together as sort of, you know, sort of care activities, caring activities. But then you have something like the financial sector, right? Which is which is always, or let's say the business service sector in general, which is a very large part of the US economy, which has nothing to do with any of those activities that I just described. They're very, very different labor processes. They have different functions within the kind of total dynamic of the economy. And of course, they're paid much differently. If you work as an accountant, you work in the financial sector, you're paid much different than if you work caring for children and so on and so forth. So these are all thought of as being service sector activities. And of course, they are activities which, for the most part, maybe less so in the business service sector, are thought of as being labor intensive. And they're labor intensive. What that means is, of course, there's not much capital that's being mobilized in labor process. But also it means, again, that there's a kind of fragmentation, or a kind of individuation of skill patterns within the labor process. And the implications of this there are numerous implications of this. But the important thing I want to emphasize is there's a kind of fragmentation and dispersion that takes place when at the level of the class itself. And this takes place at the level of again, skills, wages, and labor process, but also spatially. You have smaller and smaller workplaces, for example, but you also have workplaces which are more spread out. And there's some reasons why, again, in the book, I talk about this, why that necessarily is the case. This brings up the question, the class composition question. This brings up, of course, the two examples that I cite in the book. In the US in particular, there's been a kind of really impressive wave of teacher strikes across the country, including in districts or in states which are considered conservative or Republican states. And of course, in France, there's this kind of very inscrutable, in some sense, revolt of the Gilets jaunes, which itself had lots of contradictions in terms of the composition of the movement, but also the forms of struggle of the movement. And I tried to connect this deindustrialization process. Again, I'm not entirely sure that's the word I'd like to use, but it's the one that makes the most sense in this context. I think that in some sense, the kind of fragmentation of the class that I try to describe necessarily gives rise to revolts like the one we saw among the Gilets jaunes. So let me come to the question of services a little bit, because it's I've sort of alluded to this in various ways thus far, but let me just say a few things. It's really important to criticize this notion of a service sector or even a service as something that you can describe as a kind of socially or economically relevant category. And of course, again, it's an old concept. You find it in Adam Smith and so on and so forth. And it usually, the definition of a service is derived from the nature of the labor process or the nature of the product itself. That is to say, it's usually a product or a good, in this case, which is consumed simultaneously with its production. So if I give a haircut, one doesn't produce a haircut which is then consumed, a month later or 2 months later or what have you. It's consumed at the moment of production. That's the kind of definition that Smith proposes, and it's also the definition that people use in everyday life and business press and so on and so forth. So I really try to critically dismantle as best I can this concept. And I do it in a couple steps. The first is I talk about this very famous economist named William Baumol, who has a very famous article from the 60s, where he actually differentiates between what he calls technologically progressive activities versus technologically stagnant activities. And those roughly map onto the distinction between, industrial lines of production and services. But they don't necessarily entirely coincide with them. Now, there are a couple problems with his account, which I go, again, at great length in the book, but I would say that one of the things that's important to remember is that many services, or many activities we characterize as services, are taking place in the public sector. And this is, if you believe that Marxist kind of value theory is useful, this is one of the fundamental distinctions one has to make between the private economy and the public sector. So that's the first thing. So the activities in the public sector are not paid out of capital, but they're paid out of revenues collected or confiscated, extracted from the private economy by the state. And this has all sorts of implications that have to be examined. Of course, the other distinction that's really essential for me is the distinction, and so the shift is from manufacturing and services to technologically progressive and technologically stagnant sector, to finally activities which are productive of value versus those which are not productive of value. And this is really, really key, sort of core of the book in some sense. Now, the sort of conclusion that I arrive at, not by myself necessarily, but through sort of dialogue with some other writers like Fred Mosley, for example, is that there's a long-term tendency in the capitalist mode of production for there to be a rising ratio of unproductive activities relative to productive activities. And this is a very, very complicated argument to make, and Marx doesn't make it very well. In fact, it tends to be people like Paul Maddock, and then people that are kind of working in in Maddox's sort of wake, who developed this in a more coherent way or kind of useful way. But nevertheless, that's a key point of the argument I wanted to make, is that we really need to shift our account of productivity from one in which we use a kind of mainstream economic account of what productivity is, to one in which we account for the difference between those activities which produce value and those activities which do not. And again, this is a very, very simple distinction, but it's really, really crucial in some sense. So in any case, that's the movement of the book, is to sort of start with these kind of ready-made terms and to sort of pull them apart and try to both reframe what the discourse is, but also to draw out some of the implications. Finally, I'll just talk about let me talk about the smartphone and the metropolis for a second, because this is something that I don't develop really at all in the book, but it's actually really important, I think, for thinking about some of the implications of the book. Now, of course, the starting point of the book, as I said earlier, is this idea of a productivity paradox, right? And if Salo in 1987 could say, I see productivity everywhere, but in the statistics, you could say the same about the so-called smartphone, right? Just 2007, 2008 is when it sort of is first marketed. And of course, it sort of coincides with this massive global crisis of beginning in 2007, but then onward. And that's interesting as a kind of historical fact or anecdote. But what's interesting for me is that I think that it's very much the case that in terms of everyday life, in terms of leisure, sociality, political discourse, shopping, and so on and so forth, this strange device, has transformed the way that people relate to those activities. But it certainly hasn't affected worker or labor productivity on a broad scale. Maybe certain industries, I don't know. So that's an important thing to emphasize, is that kind of discrepancy. The second thing is to note that the term smart is not simply about smartphones. It's an entire paradigm of thinking about contemporary, what's the word, kind of governance, if you like, right? There's a smart home, smart factory, the smart city, the smartphone, right? And to some extent, the notion of the smart city is really, really fascinating to me. And of course, Barcelona is a city where there was a kind of very, very concerted effort by a left-wing mayor to introduce this notion of a kind of new civic dynamism around this notion of a smart city. So I'll just say a few things. I mean, the smart city that's something that I would like to work more on, I have to say. But one of the functions of the smartphone, is people who've been reading the news in the US know, is that it's functions first and foremost at the level of, let's say, governance or kind of social control, as a kind of tracking device, right? And so people who were involved in the riot at the Capitol a week ago, I guess now. Of course, the FBI is examining everyone's phone records, because it's very easy to place you at the site of in real time using those records, right? And it's, even if you're not using your phone, and many of them were actually live streaming and doing insane things. Nevertheless, your phone is, of course, if it's on, it's constantly pinging cell towers and kind of locating one. So it has a kind of function there, which is largely a kind of governmental one, beyond the way it affects the way we interact with each other in a kind of social manner, or the way we produce and circulate political discourse and so on. Now, the metropolis. What's the relationship between the smart city and the metropolis? I have always understood the metropolis to be ultimately have its roots in the workerist account of the social factory. And what that meant to me is that if we understand the factory to be a moment of the total social process, and if we understand the factory to be the site in which value is produced, and that society as a whole is the site, if you like, where the reproduction of the class relation is occurring, that in the era of, let's say, formal subsumption, the articulation of the production process and the reproduction process is relatively contingent. And that the kind of era of post-war industrial capitalism, let's say call it the era of real subsumption, implies a subordination of the social process of social reproduction to the factory, to the requirements of production. So it's not a question. So there's this kind of integration of production and reproduction, social reproduction, at a kind of level of the social whole itself, in which the whole, in some sense, is subordinated to a part, right? The factory as a privileged site within that totality. Now, what's important about this, in my understanding of it, is it doesn't collapse the distinction between those two moments, but rather simply inverts their relationship. And what that means ultimately is the metropolis is the name for the moment when the social process, let's say, is not only subordinated to the exigencies of the factory, but the society is remade in the image of the factory itself, in a kind of spatial and material terms, and also geographical terms, I would say. That is to say that the kind of way in which, for example, production of value and circulation of value are articulated spatially, or the way in which class formation is sort of determined or distributed spatially and geographically. Now, of course, the point of the smartphone in some sense is it equalizes all these articulations in some sense, or it kind of seems to transcend those articulations, right? Because it's a kind of spatial concept, which is a kind of topological concept, right? It's not a geographical notion of space, but it's a kind of one in which everyone is at an equal distance from the network, right? Because there's no center. And I think this is really important in some way in thinking about the notion of metropolis as a concept. But I also wanted to stress that there's also this counter tendency, which is to say that we also know that in an economy with no growth, and in which lots of capital is allocated not towards productive activities, but towards real estate and towards kind of assets more generally, the city has taken on this new figure. And it's the city, the central city in particular, of places like Paris, Barcelona, Los Angeles, New York, in which urban real estate becomes this kind of fundamental kind of asset class. And it's a very, very classical image of the city. The city is a kind of integrated core, but which is separated from the suburbs and the exurbs. But I'm sure it's the same probably in Mexico City as well. It's a huge city, but I imagine there's similar effects. So there's this kind of tension between the way in which the smartphone and a kind of topological conception of space annuls classical distinctions between the city and the countryside, let's say, or the urban core and the suburbs and so on and so forth. But there's also this kind of counter tendency in which cities, London is probably a very good example as well. These kind of classical old cities, the cities of the factory, become instead sites where the property owning classes invest money in assets rather than in production. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I think I've been talking for 30 minutes, and I'm embarrassed to have done so. But I did want to address in however oblique a way I could some of the points raised by the two interventions earlier. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but I'm going to stop nevertheless.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Jason. And I don't know if Martin now or Luhuna want to add or pick up on anything that Jason said before we open it for more general questions.
Not right now. I'll wait for some questions and maybe then hop back on.
Yeah, I will also wait. Thank you.
Well, we do have two questions already. I don't know. I think that more or less they have been thematized in what you said, Jason. But in case you want to add anything, there was one question from Elisenda from Barcelona. Bueno, de hecho, Elisenda, si quieres hacerla tú misma, me parece bien, a menos que quieras que yo la lea o la parafrasee. Tienes el micrófono en silencio.
So can you translate for me, Gerardo?
El micrófono está en mute, Elisenda.
Oh, I see. Okay.
The microphone is off.
I see.
Or maybe it's not working. I don't know. No se escucha. Bueno.
No. Sorry. I don't see Barcelona as a smart city. At least I haven't noticed any change in my everyday life. Well, there are lots of people are working on it. Okay, in a technological cluster next to Poblenou, and there's a whole area devoted to it. But as I work in my teaching job, I don't see any this has produced any change. I mean, I don't know. Perhaps it's the government's, it's the politicians' propaganda, because Barcelona is no. Well, I'm from well, I can say I'm a middle class person, and I have seen no changes about it all. So though we have this kind of propaganda in the newspapers about Barcelona being a smart city, and a lot of people working on it, but I don't see it. I don't see it in at least on many citizens' lives. That's a point I would like to raise. Well, or that sometimes this all has a political how can I say, this is all political.
Gracias, Elisenda. Te agradezco mucho la pregunta. There is another question from Elena, who I think just left. And her question was, she sent it to me, I don't know if it was in the chat or privately, but she said whether stagnation in the book is a new regime of general crisis in the Schumpeterian or Schumpeter's definition, basically as a way to intensify what Schumpeter understood of the creative crisis of capitalism.
Should I respond quickly?
Yeah, let's just these two questions. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, the first thing about the smart city, I think this is really. I'm really happy that you intervened in this way, because I think it's quite interesting, of course, that you are noting the discrepancy between the discourse around we're going to make Barcelona a smart city, and if I understand correctly, it was a nominally left-wing mayor that's making the claims, right? There's this kind of discrepancy between the claims about the smart city and the actual experience that people have. That's number one. And I think it's very, very important that there's a kind of left version of the discourse. It's not simply a kind of capitalist business school discourse, although it's very much that as well. The second thing, though, is probably the one change that's less visible, maybe to you in particular, but probably maybe not to everyone, is that policing has probably changed dramatically. That is to say, the way the police force operates has probably been transformed somewhat dramatically by the implementation of smart features in the city. Because essentially it means that the city is being constantly surveilled through sensors, right? And so I would imagine
that's right.
So I think that's so it's interesting because you can be very cynical about this smart discourse and say, well, okay, what in fact is going on? I mean, on the one hand, in terms of consumers, people, middle-class people who use their phones all the time, it's collecting all sorts of data that's then being sort of synthesized and treated algorithmically and then being used by whatever corporations and so on and so forth. But then, of course, at the level of the way the society, or excuse me, the city is managed and controlled, of course, police are using whatever kind of mechanisms of detection that you are logging onto as a means of not only investigating what they understand to be crimes, but also in some sense predictive policing. I'm sure you've heard of this idea, this notion that, for example, in Los Angeles, but elsewhere as well, there are these kind of algorithms that the police use to try to anticipate where crimes might occur, right? And so therefore they will send more cops to a particular area. Of course, it's always the same area. It's no surprise where they send the cops to. But the implication being that it's not simply detecting crimes in action, but through the gathering of data and through the treatment of the data, one can in fact prevent crimes by anticipating where they might occur, right? And so I think that's what a smart city is on some level, but it's given a kind of ideological kind of dress, or ideological makeup, I guess you can say, something like that, a kind of that allows people to sort of identify it as a kind of form of citizen engagement or something like that. A city that's a new 21st century city that's efficient, ecological, and so on and so forth. So I think that's it's interesting that because Barcelona stands out for me for a number of reasons, which I could maybe come to, but that's the first point. The second point, Gerardo, remind me of the second question because I had a short response to it.
The difference between stagnation and the creative destruction.
Oh yeah. I don't know. I mean, clearly, I would just say what I said earlier, that there has been, particularly in the 30s, for obvious reasons, particularly in the US, there were, because actually it was at Harvard, in fact, one small economics department in the US, there was a kind of very lively debate in 37 in particular, because during the Depression in the US, there was a kind of double dip depression where they were coming out of the Depression, it seemed, in the mid 30s, and then 37, there was another kind of collapse. And so there was this kind of desire to theorize that maybe in fact, the Depression wasn't part of a kind of business cycle that would be, 10-year business cycle, maybe a kind of more intense downturn, but still part of a cyclical process, but in fact would be a long-term kind of tendency of mature capitalist economies. And Schumpeter was part of this discourse, of course. But for me, what I try to do in some sense is start from the discourse around stagnation and then shift into a register that is closer to what the question posed, which is the notion of an idea of crisis, but crisis as a kind of a crisis of accumulation. That is to say, a crisis which is not one of a kind of Schumpeterian dynamism, but one of a kind of unrelenting but also uneven crisis unfolding over not a 2 or 3 year period, but over the course of a decade or more. So.
Perfect. Thank you. We have now 2 more questions. Benjamin has a question.
I suggest you take Jimenez before Gerardo.
Oh, okay. Jimena has a short question. She asked whether you, Jason, have grappled with the concept of digital proletariat that sometimes is used by Marcus Gabriel.
Yeah, I see that. I don't know his work at all. I know the name. That's it. I'm old enough that for me, Empire, the book by Negri and Hart, and more generally, the kind of post-workerist theses on immaterial labor and so on and so forth from the 90s, shapes in somewhat negative way my reaction to ideas of digital proletariat. Of course, it's very interesting. I have no idea what Marcus Gabriel says, and so maybe Jimena can explain. But I have a certain aversion to the term digital, something like digital proletariat, for reasons that have to do with my personal theoretical history. But I think it's probably an interesting way to think about, for example, I mean, for me, what's important to think about is the relationship between, for example, labor intensive service activities, which nevertheless incorporate digital functions, usually at the level of supervision. So for example, I was thinking about an Amazon warehouse, right? One of the things that I might mention in the book, I can't remember, but Amazon had patented a kind of bracelet, a kind of digital bracelet that workers who are sorting products in a warehouse wear on their wrist. And the idea is that if you place the wrong thing in the wrong box, the thing will actually buzz on your wrist, right? So the idea is that somehow it will correct you, a bit like a dog collar, right? You know, these kind of electrical collars for dogs. But the idea is that somehow, if the activity you perform is the wrong movement, the wrong gesture, it will somehow detect that and indicate that through some kind of physical response. And what's fascinating about this is that it's perhaps going to create a more efficient, sorting process. But it's not exactly what we have in mind when we think about automation of labor, right? Because it's not replacing the sorting process. It's simply replacing the supervision of the sorting process, right? It's automating the supervisory task, not the actual task itself, or the actual process itself. And that's something that I think is really, really important, is that to the extent that we see automation introduced into the service sector, it tends to be these supervisory functions. And the supervisory functions exist primarily to intensify the labor process, make people work faster, work harder, right? But it doesn't necessarily increase productivity through replacing activity. It sweats the activity, to use this kind of weird term sociologists use. So so when I think of digital proletariat, just totally extemporizing on the term, I think a little bit like that. It's not like people at a keyboard doing brilliant things, like designers and this sort of thing. It's people in warehouses with collars who are being kind of sort of controlled through some kind of supervisory function. So that's automated in some way. I think, also certainly like something like Uber, to use a very egregious example, the function of the digital component of that particular model tends primarily to be, one in which there's a constant surveillance of the person who is otherwise self-employed, their activity, right? And I've actually read that, in fact, Uber will oftentimes monitor the activity of the Uber driver even when they're not at work, right? And so anyway, that's what I think of when I think about a kind of figure of the digital proletariat. It's not the 90s cyberpunk version, the hacker or what have you. It's the warehouse and the surveillance,
And Benjamin.
Well, thank you so much to the three of you. I have not read the book, which I apologize for, but I've been very drawn by the presentation and I'm very interested by it. I found it a very sobering description. And I come to these thoughts from two places. Basically, I'm a practicing psychoanalyst, and I also look after the economic destinies of this institute. So I spend quite a lot of my time thinking about how to make ends meet and for a small independent project that basically started with very, very little capital. And I mean, I think the clearest way of getting at I'm trying to articulate is perhaps saying something like the following. On the one hand, it has a very sobering effect to separate very clearly the sort of the digital sphere from the nuts and bolts of the real economy, to say it in terms similar to what you've said, Jason. On the other, there is always a complex relation between economics and the psyche, right? Of course, it's a very classic debate, and it's an ongoing debate. My own position on that is basically that there is a chiasmus between the two. The two being, let us call it the economy, and what I might refer to as the libidinal economy. So, in a way, I'm wondering whether this chiasmus is not massively reflected in the types of problems that you're broaching. In other words, the massive impact in our day-to-day lives of this digital sphere is quite clear. And this sobering perspective that in fact it has very little bearing on the nuts and bolts of the real economy is very revealing. And at the same time, it begs a question, you know, how we put the two back together again. Now, I have a general sense of what your take on this is, but I think the question put by Jimena in a way points at the need to respond in terms that you might find appropriate to a sort of political economy of the digital, in a way, which goes beyond turning back to the real economy perspective. So I basically want to provoke you back into you know, perhaps responding or somehow reaffirming your positions. I mean, do you think such a thing is possible, or would you take recourse to the more classical take, which is, as I understand what you've done, that in fact, you know, there's no need to move away from the you know, the sort of infrastructural perspective, that the real economy is in fact untouched by all these developments fundamentally, and that therefore we're talking about forms of alienation, like the articulation of the further articulation of forms of alienation. And I mean, basically, I suppose it's an invitation to talk a bit more about these questions on the basis of my need to make sense of both things at the same time, both the economics and the psychical, for reasons I've underlined. And I mean, basically, my appreciation to all of you. It's been fantastic to hear all the interventions.
I'll make a quick point. I mean, I'm not exactly sure. I know the term libidinal economy, but I'm not sure exactly if I understand it the way you do. I would say that the broad question that you're asking is that, am I not making too radical a distinction between the actual affective transformation that digital, and particularly smartphones, I think there is a kind of rupture there with the smartphone. The kind of transformations that they have produced, and this kind of so-called economic sphere, which is totally separate and in which we see very little effect. I think that maybe you're right, and I think that maybe if they're in a slightly different context, this is probably that context, I would probably emphasize things a little bit differently. I mean, so for example, let's take Luhuna's example of navigating a city, right? I mean, there's a kind of incredible experience if you lived before the 2010 or whatever it was, of walking across a city without a map or without a digital device, GPS device, which allows you to encounter, in very dramatic terms, class separations within the city. For example, I mean, oftentimes I was in Barcelona two summers ago, or whenever I traveled last, and I was walking to a restaurant with my son and wife, and there were these very, very clear distinctions, of course, crossing a big boulevard from a kind of bourgeois area that's quite beautiful buildings that look like they belong in Paris or wherever, kind of late 19th century apartment buildings. And then you very clearly you shift into a working class neighborhood with all that implies in terms of the decor. But the experience that people have of the city in particular is something that's been really radically transformed by the fact that they have no relationship to the kind of geographical disposition of the city. And geographical meaning the kinds of people that live there, the distinctions in class, the kinds of activities that go on in one section of the city versus the other. I think that's a very profound loss. It's a kind of illiteracy, right? And of course, within, for example, the context that I just described, in which people find themselves surveilled not by a boss, but by a digital apparatus, I think there's an experience of alienation that's even more profound than one already experiences when domination is made impersonal in a kind of digital form. So all those things are very, very important parts of this discussion, absolutely. I think because my book is in part a polemic against a kind of discourse, which I don't take very seriously, for better or for worse, that is to say the kind of business school discourse about automation, I feel like maybe I emphasize the distinction for those polemical reasons, if that makes sense. Maybe Mårten and Luhuna or Gerardo have other thoughts on this.
I have another question based on all you said, but I don't know if I can build it right. A side note, like you were talking about Barcelona to Elisenda, no? Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that precisely might be not exactly like to the year, but precisely the moment where the discourse of Barcelona as a smart city, a new city, with the new civic laws, I don't know if that would be like the translation, but the laws that would regulate civic life in Barcelona streets, was contemporary to the introduction of the Catalan police, the Mossos d'Esquadra, which came into power in 2003 or 2004, if I'm not mistaken. They showed like a huge increase in police violence the next year. Like they had more police violence cases in the first 3 months of the Mossos d'Esquadra than the Spanish police had all the year. And I mean, I was living there at the time, and it was like a very clear break in what the city was in 2002 and the city was in 2004. But anyway, I'll try to sketch this out. Your description of industrialization hinges around a concept of increasing abstraction as equivalence, in the sense of lack of difference in between elements. No, in the sense there's the technological equivalence leads to a sort of like wage and methodology of work equivalence and equality, which on the other hand stems from the money as the general equivalent. And so there's like this kind of like chain work of causality, of increasing social abstraction that kind of like feeds into itself, no? But on the other hand, when you discuss deindustrialization as fragmentation, it doesn't mean that like all these abstractions, what holds them together, the kind of like the political system that holds them together as abstractions collapses, and the feverish of concreteness erupts through social life. On the contrary, it seems like what we witness in deindustrialization, this kind of like fragmented abstractions or like antagonistic abstractions, which kind of like connects what I was saying, like teachers versus gilets jaunes, no? They're kind of like, it's kind of like antagonist abstractions, no? And I was thinking about this because then again, like our descriptions of the metropolitan territory are also discussed in terms of this increasing abstraction. And you said like there's no longer a center, and in precisely the kind of like the smartphone as a device that makes everything similarly equal and distant, while at the same time being contemporary to kind of like a destruction of the classical idea of the city that happens through like foreign investments, but not only to foreign investment, also through well, the neighborhood where I live, Arroios, was just called the coolest neighborhood in the world by Time Out magazine, New York. So it means like all of our cities have their own Williamsburg, or I don't know, Colonia Rosa. Well, I don't remember the name of like those neighborhoods, but like even Lisbon has a neighborhood like that, no? So it's kind of like they're like also becoming this kind of like increasing like separated abstractions, equal and different, all the same. But this to get at something else, which is like you claim, and I agree. I was like thinking about that, but I do agree with it. But that there's not like a collapse between production and social reproduction, obviously, because social reproduction itself does not produce value, at least in like very clear terms. Is not productive like that, no. And one is subject to the other, no. But what I mean, if we talk about deindustrialization, it's sort of kind of like as Martin was saying, kind of the limits of production. Can we have like social reproduction once we can't really talk about production anymore? This is because social reproduction is not kind of like a natural social element,
right?
But it's more kind of like how a social body stays cohesed, stays the same, survives collapse, survives history, and the passing of time kind of like renews itself, no? But the social cohesion of this social body that reproduces is given by production and the apparatuses and sovereign apparatus that govern production, no? So and so this is something that is also present in Alquati and Panzieri, was that like the discipline within the factory wasn't merely due to economic terms, so kind of like the extraction of surplus cell, but it kind of like mirrored the management of society, of political society as a whole, no? And so it seems like social reproduction becomes an end in itself, And I mean, this is not a little question, but it's kind of like how all of these things kind of like connected. I don't know if you want to comment on this. I know it's a lot.
Let me just say one thing about the abstraction question, which you start with, because it's a very important one. And of course, that Marx, he says, well, there's this idea of abstract labor at the beginning of Volume 1, in which all the different concrete labor processes are sort of equalized or equated in some sense through the process of exchange, right? And through the process of monetary exchange specifically. So that's a kind of notion of abstract labor, right? But then he also says elsewhere, the Grundrisse and in certain parts of Capital, that this kind of formal equation of concrete labors, or formal abstraction of concrete labors, is empirically verified through the increasing, the increasing similarity of labor processes as industrialization unfolds, right? And so he says there's a kind of abstraction of labor because everyone in the various kind of industries are all performing labor processes that are quite similar, right? Because they're using the same technology, right? Steam engines and so on and so forth. And so it comes back to this question that Mårten brought up at the beginning of the conceptual, the conceptual origins of the capitalist mode of production. On the one hand, abstract labor is a purely formal element, right? That concrete labors are equated in the act of monetary exchange. But that doesn't mean that they're empirically similar, right? It means that despite their concrete differences, their empirical variety, they are nevertheless equated in the process of exchange. But he says that historically, empirically, you find that the formal equivalence of concrete labor that's equalized in the, or that's equated in the exchange process is sort of empirically or materially also sort of verified, if you like, by the fact that as industrialization takes place, labor processes that were formerly quite distinct become more and more similar. And therefore, as you reiterated, what that usually means is skill levels tend to be equalized, and therefore wages and so on and so forth. And so I think it's very important to just make that distinction in Marx, because Marx, it comes back to this question of the concept of the capitalist mode of production and the material form which is most adequate to that concept. And he constantly makes this distinction, especially in the Grundrisse, in fact, when he's discussing the automatic factory. He's like, well, the automatic factory is the mode of producing that is adequate to the concept of capital. The implication being that manufacture or cooperation are, of course, employed by capitalists as forms of producing, modes of producing, but they are not adequate. They are not adequate conceptually, or they are not adequate in empirical terms to the concept of capital. And so I think that's the same kind of relationship is being talked about by Marx when he talks about abstract labor in the discussion of value and money, and then later on when he talks about the factory and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to make that point because it's very important to me, and I think it connects with something that Mårten said earlier. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, excellent. We have one question from Mårten, or intervention, and then I'm gonna have my authority to make one question myself.
Yeah, I was thinking about Benjamin's comments because I also thought a lot about, well, the psych economy and the libidinal economy when I read the book, and I was thinking on page, well, on 60, I think it is 59-60, when you discuss this right-wing commentator Nicholas Eberstadt and how he talks about the dreadful collapse of work and the invisible crisis, and frames the processes that you're describing as this kind of well, a crisis of masculinity and so forth. And I read, before I read your book, I read Ross Douthat, the New York Times journalist or essayist, his book, The Decadent, I think it's called, The Decadent Society, how we became the victims of our own success. It's actually quite interesting. It's much better than I thought. It's actually full of interesting statistics, and he's much more honest than I thought it was. I was quite surprised how good it was. And one fascinating thing, though, with that book, which shows a form of psychic change, that I started to think about when Benjamin asked his comment, is the sense that, so we have this. So Ross Douthat is this rather conservative Catholic, right-wing man, and in the end, what his ideal, his United States, the United States he wants back is the United States of 1969. Isn't that quite fascinating? In the sense that, the landing of the moon, the whole kind of technological potentiality that he saw there. And he's not only lamenting the fact that people don't marry, don't have kids, he's even lamenting the fact that people don't have sex, that young kids don't go out and pick fight any longer. So there's really this weird transformation of the social mores that pushes, in a sense, that creates what I would call a confusion of identities. It's really something, so we have this Catholic, this Catholic conservative essayists, actually lamenting the fact the youth are not going out there fucking before marriage and picking fights. And to me, that points to this kind of, stagnation in a sense. It's really a stagnation of imagination, a kind of stagnation of the faculty of the soul in a sense. Since every one of us, I mean, I'm the same there. We're all looking backwards in a sense in order to understand our times. But I think what we must do in order to be true to our contemporary situation and to look forward is really to try to see if there's some kind of way out through this decay, through this stagnation. And I think that's what your book is pointing to, actually. So it was just a comment on the psychic situation and the form of a speculative question of affirming stagnation in order to move out of this world, in a sense.
Can I ask one question? Does he specifically say 1969 as the year that he fantasizes about?
Yeah, man, I can. Yeah, it begins with yeah.
Because I could cite many things besides the moon landing that work. That when I think of 69, it's not the moon landing. So
no, but it's yeah.
But I understand very well what you mean. I think isn't the beginning of Society of the Spectacle the film? I think it opens with a shot of the Earth from the moon. Huh. It's like the opening image of the film. It's quite beautiful. So maybe he's thinking of the film. I don't know.
But it really shows that the only thing that conservatives can conserve is capitalist progress, in a sense.
Oh,
and
right.
That's like,
certainly from the perspective of decades of stagnation.
Yeah.
It's going to look in retrospect, it's going to look like something that's something that it wasn't.
Exactly. Yeah.
But maybe Benjamin has a response to that.
Well, I thought that was a fascinating comment. More or less, it connects to what I was going to say or throw here, which is also this problem of stagnation. I have to say that I learned a lot from the book. I am not well versed in political economy, so in that way, this book is useful to learn and to push forward other sort of political theoretical questions for sure. But I think that one of the models, that continues in the book, repeats in the book is James Bogg model that there is nowhere to go, right? And I think it speaks clearly to this problem of stagnation, which I would translate and link to the problem of the metropolis. The metropolis not merely as a sort of urbanization topology, but also as a sort of reduction, of experience in the world. As a sort of metaphysical construction of rendering immobility, in a way, in everything that entails theoretically, in a way. And so I wanted to see what you say, Jason. I know that this is a little bit pushing beyond what your book is about, and the very limited sort of framework of your argument. But at the very end of the book, you sign Bogg, who I didn't know. Now I will buy his books. He was a African American labor union leader, I believe, right, and writer. And you say very provocatively that you cite him first, and you say that you cite him to launch a revolt powerful enough to smash the union, the company, and the state. And then you say that Bogg's accent was less on negation than discovery, right? And so I was intrigued by that because it seems to me that precisely what is at stake in the metropolis and in this question of immobility is this idea of the lack, right? The total structuration of life by the principle of general equivalence, which, for instance, for Nancy is the name of contemporary nihilism. And so this idea of the discovery is very seductive, I think, very interesting, because it seems to me that it's pointing, right, towards a sort of exodus, so towards a movement onwards, as Martin would say. But the question is, can this movement be still a political strategy? So, for instance, a lot of us here today have talked about the concept of movement, worker movement, political movement, Could this discovery that you bring out at the very end of the book, is it still part of a sort of a strategy of a movement, or does it have to? Is it something that is beneath, the problem of movement, beneath the problem of politics, which are no longer, it seems to me, capable of taking this task forward?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, again, I think that part of the point of the book is to leave us right on that precipice of that question, right? And in some sense, I mean, Boggs is I wrote these 2 essays in Brooklyn Rail a couple of years ago called Nowhere to Go, in which Boggs is really the important figure for me in terms of thinking about automation. And in some sense, Boggs disappears from this book until the end. And there are a number of reasons for that, in part because I realized how profound Boggs's book, The American Revolution, really is in terms of thinking through a number of questions which are both pertinent to his own historical moment, early 60s, late 50s, but also today in somewhat transformed terms. And but nevertheless, the point, and so I will write more on Boggs because I have a lot more to say about. In some sense, there wasn't a context for me to adequately address Boggs in the book. Nevertheless, what's fascinating about Boggs for me is, he's writing in 62, something like that. And he's describing in particular the automation of the automotive industry in the mid 50s, right? And of course, automation, the term itself comes from a Ford vice president. And so it's something that's associated with the automobile industry in particular, with Ford. What's interesting for Boggs is that, he's someone who's a veteran of all the great struggles of the CIO from the late 30s into the 50s. And in particular, Boggs describes at great length all the wildcat strikes that workers undertook from the late 30s throughout the war, which is part of the history of World War II, which is not very well known in the US, is there were just hundreds and hundreds of wildcat strikes throughout the war by workers. And workers felt very empowered for lots of reasons to undertake these kinds of non-union sponsored strikes. And even after the war, there was this massive, actually in France as well, there was a massive wave of strikes in 46, 47. And there was a real sense in the US, the core of the US industry, particularly the automobile industry, that there was a great deal of consolidated worker power on the shop floor. And so Boggs's argument is essentially that the point of, and you can see why this is appealing to the Italian operaisti, that the point of automation was primarily to take control over the shop floor again. And it does this both by, of course, by de-skilling workers, for example, making the labor process more and more incorporated into the objective machinery rather than the subjective labor of the workers. So in other words, as the technical composition of capital rises, workers have less control over the labor process. It's the basic idea, right? And there's a number of factors that he sort of draws from this. First of all, it was automation. The idea behind automation is it's supposed to crush the union, by which he means the CIO. And there's a whole history there in the mid 50s about the AFL and the CIO and the role the union plays in assenting to the automation of the automobile industry. That is to say, they actively took a part in this process of transforming the way automobiles are produced. And they did it precisely as a gesture or as a strategy for control over their own rank and file, if you understand what I'm saying. And so Boggs is like, it's the end of the union. It's the end of the union, not in the sense of trade unions or whatever, but the CIO as a militant union. And it also means, of course, that the first people to lose their jobs in the automobile industry are going to be Black workers for many, many reasons. You know, the assembly lines, you know, integrating the assembly lines was a real struggle in the 40s, just to have Black workers and white workers on the same assembly line, you know. And of course, in Detroit, there were racial barriers for Black workers they couldn't live in the same neighborhoods as white workers, and so on and so forth. So, and there was much conflict in the 40s as Black workers integrated, or as they immigrated to industrial centers. So the point of Boggs's remarks is simply that, in terms of speaking of this nowhere to go idea, is that he didn't quite see that there would be this massive expansion of the service sector, right? And it only really occurs in the late 60s, early 70s that you see this explosion of the service sector. And it's also the moment when women begin to enter the workforce in great, you know, in large numbers. And so in some sense, there's a kind of limitation to his analysis. But his account of the first wave of automation and the effects of that wave of the strategic horizon, but also the effects of that wave of automation in the 40s and 50s is absolutely brilliant. And so, but nevertheless, it's a very negative account, right? Nowhere to go, right? I mean, it's like the old union is dead and we have nowhere to go, right? And yet he says, as if to somehow break open the kind of trap that he's, you know, walled us into, to say, nevertheless, it's a question of invention, of struggle and invention. And if we have to destroy the old union, which is now integrated into the management of the factories, we will destroy the old union and build a new form of worker power. And it might be a union, it might be a mass movement, it might be I don't know, insurrection, you know, like I don't know. But that's the point that I wanted to end the book on in a kind of subtle way, is that the context we find ourselves in now is largely one of decomposition. But nevertheless, Boggs is someone who can, for me, is a kind of authority. He's a kind of a tutelary figure. And his voice allows one to articulate this idea that we're going to destroy that world. We're being destroyed by that world, but we're going to destroy that world as we struggle our way through the ruins of that world. But we're going to build something else. But we don't know what it is, and it's only in the struggles themselves that we can invent this new form or this new experience of struggle. So that was kind of the point of Boggs. But I will come back to Boggs in another context, because I think he's the most important political, radical, revolutionary thinker in American history and of the 20th century, mid-20th century. He's by far the most important, I think. And I wanted to be able to say that, you know, in this context. So.
Thank you, Jason. I think we have time for one more question from Benjamin, and then we can wrap it up.
Thank you. I just want to briefly link a couple of things. So, Jason, of course, I fully understand your comment about the polemic context of your book, and I think, I mean, it's clear. In fact, what I want to do is relate the question about the psyche to Gerardo's written response to your book, which he just shared on a link a little while ago, because I think there is convergence there with what I might be able to say psychoanalytically, and that is that he ends by underlining the importance of affirming that place in the margins of the system, or even the external to the system of capital, and also to this sort of massive digitized system, which analytically I think corresponds also to a place where a form of rearticulation of desire might be possible. which of course has the paradox of how that desire is going to manifest itself without being sucked into the system, in the system of capital in the same terms. But I think the response that furnishes, if I'm being clear, is that in this chiasmus that I'm describing between the psychic and the economic, that Mårten was also referring to, in fact, it's possible for us from the perspective of a certain search for possibilities of resistance to actually pair the two together, so that the margins of the economic system and the psychical margins of the system can somehow relate to each other, and we can actually get new possibilities taking place on the basis of that topological location. So this is only an outline, of course, but I refer everyone to Gerardo's text, which I think is very detailed and very suggestive reading of the book, and also of some of these possibilities that we've been talking about in this respect. So thank you very much.
Okay, perfect. So we can leave it here. And of course, I want to thank Jason first and foremost for, spending the time and sharing, this lively discussion about his book, which again, I would recommend everyone to go and get a copy from Reaktion Books. This is it, Smart Machines, available now everywhere too. And so, solamente para recordar, la próxima vez, en febrero 14, tenemos a Enrique Juliana y Teresa Vilarós y Santi Alba Rico para hablar sobre la transición política española y la crisis política en la España contemporánea. So thank you, Luhuna and Mårten and Benjamin and everyone who's present. And I guess we'll continue the discussion in other venues soon.